Hello, everyone. So today we're going to talk about community ecology amongst other things as well. So here's just kind of a diagram of different species diversity and community structure. Remember that this is not the end all be all. Tropical rainforest, for the desert scrub, this is the end all be all. So please do not think that like this is definitely what an end all community is. They're all going to be very different. And we'll look at that when we focus on biomes. We talked about niche or niche a little bit before. Again, that word can be used either way, or pronunciation either way is fine. Is fine. So, how many potential ecological niches occur? How they resemble or differ from each other, and how the species occupy different niches and interactions. That's really what niche structure is going to look at. So, when we talk about niche specialization, a lot of times species have overlapping ranges of resource use, whether that be habitat, whether that be food source, that doesn't matter. There's often overlap. And so, when there's overlap, a couple of things can happen. Oftentimes, one species will kind of beat out the other one for resource use. And we'll look at that on the next couple of slides. Not always. Sometimes the species will have completely separate things that they use, but oftentimes there are overlap. When there is overlap, one of the things I would say that this is actually rare, but sometimes neither species takes the region of overlap. They both kind of just depart so that they don't have to compete, but oftentimes one will kind of beat out the other. A couple different kind of definition things. So inter-specific competition between members of different species. The way I remember this, I think of the interstate highway. So interstate means that it's between multiple states. So the five is between Washington and Oregon and California. It's between multiple states. Intra-state highways technically are within one state. So different species. So interference competition is just one of those types. One species blocks another species access to a resource. So for example, here, I don't know what animal this is, but the hyena is eating it and blocking these bird species from being able to eat it. So interference competition, not allowing these guys to go to town on this carcass here. Until the hyena's done, they ain't getting any. Maybe when the hyena's done, there'll be something left over. So again, that overlapping niche thing we talked about, oftentimes we see that, and typically you're going to have some type of competition for that middle zone where they overlap. So one way that you can do that is specialization. So avoid competition. Is it really worth it to expend your energy to fight with this other species? If not, if it's a waste of your energy, if it's not worth it, then you guys just kind of take your separate zones. So that's going to be specialization to avoid competition. And then they'll have separate niches. So it's a way to evolve, and so that you don't have to fight. There is, of course, intra-specific competition as well. So interspecific between two species fighting over a food source, for example. But there is also intra-specific competition between members of the same species. And we see this oftentimes with territoriality. I think I said that right, where you might have two different communities of apes. And if there's a zone of overlap, there might be fighting in between, ape over here and ape over here who's in charge. We see that with lions. I mean, even the Lion King is essentially that story of two male lions trying to be in charge of the pack. And there's a lot of side effects of that. So in real life, if a male it challenges a male that's in charge of a pride, then typically he will kill all the baby males if he wins. So let's say here's like male in charge of the pride, and this guy challenges, and he wins. Then he's going to go ahead and kill all the baby males because he doesn't want to have competition. So there's some pretty crazy territoriality stuff. So they can defend their pack, they can defend their location, lots of different ways that you might see intra-specific competition. There's also exploitation competition, and this one I don't see a lot of questions on, but it's still good to kind of understand the concept. But one species is more efficient or effective at getting a resource than the other, and therefore they're going to beat out their competition. I love this example of this. So again, this kind of goes back to exploitation competition. So this was in a lab setting. You have these two species of paramecium, and on their own, like in a petri dish, almost the same curve. They're really similar in terms of how they grow and what their population densities are like. But when you put them both in together, notice that the second one, P Cotadum, I don't know how to say it, doesn't matter. Basically gets wiped out and Aurelia dominates. The curve is almost exactly the same for this one. So clearly this one was more competitive at acquiring the food source than this one, and so eliminated that species. So when they're put in together, this one is far more efficient. So if they can't share, like if there's significant amount of overlap, then that's called competitive exclusion. Heavy, heavy competition. One species is going to have to be out. They can't divide this up. So one species is going to win, the other one is going to either die or move to another place or whatever. This is kind of a special story, a tale of two squirrels, so the American gray squirrel and the European red. And so, a little background on the European red squirrel. So, native to the Britain area, the red squirrels, and its population has been declining for a couple of reasons. Disease has become prevalent, and so that's been wiping them out as well. Disappearance of their homes. So, they live off of the hazel coppices and also conifer forest trees. And so, those things have been disappearing for whatever reason. And so, that could be, humans shutting them down or disease themselves. So, those two alone were kind of reducing the red squirrel population. But what also started to happen was competitive exclusion. So the alien, the gray squirrel, is not native to that area. It's native to, I believe, our land. And it was introduced to Britain. I don't know if it was purposeful or not. I don't know the context of that. And it was really easily adapted to parks and gardens. So the same places that we would see these red squirrels, these gray squirrels are now kind of appearing as well. And they started to exclude the red squirrels because the grays don't have any natural predators. They maybe are a little bit more able to adapt to other trees and things like that that the red squirrel were not. So what you see here in today's distribution is the gray squirrels have really taken over a lot of the places that the red squirrels used to be. And you'll really, if you imagine merging these together, the red squirrels are really only seen for the most part in places where the gray squirrels are not. There's a little bit of overlap down here, but for the most part, they're really only found in the places that the gray squirrels are not. They basically are like, they're better at us at getting all the things. There's no point in us being there. Let's live in these places that they're not living. I talked about this in a previous presentation, but resource partitioning is a super great way to not have to compete. It minimizes species competition for food by just kind of adjusting where they're going to eat. And so this particular species of bird, they live off of the same type of tree. So rather than just fighting with each other and losing energy over having to fight with each other, they've all kind of adapted to only getting food from a certain part of the tree. So this species here, it eats in this green zone here. This one here is in this green zone here. So these ones overlap a little bit, you can see, but this one has a larger zone here. This one, they overlap a little bit here. This one just eats at the top, so only these two compete. So instead of competing with all 5 species, maybe they only have to compete with one because they've partitioned where they're going to get their food from within that tree. Resource partitioning is very, very important for many species success. Another trigger word, keystone species. Keystone species are really important for an ecosystem's success. That's why they're called keystone species. They help to determine the type and the number and the balance of the community. So this, well, these aren't the best examples here. The sea stars are kind of, that community is being affected because their keystone species was taken out, was wiped out by humans. And so the sea stars, and by the way, not starfish, sea stars are their technical name. Starfish drives me nuts. And the sea urchin are all out of balance because the sea otters were eliminated. And so the sea otter being the keystone species messed up the whole ecosystem balance in that example. We'll talk about that more later as well. The American bison is a keystone species in the grassland community of North America. And unfortunately, bison don't exist anymore. I mean, they do, but in very small numbers. White man took it upon themselves to eliminate most of them for a couple of reasons. Some of it was for their hide, but some of it was simply to hurt the Native Americans, essentially. They knew that the Native Americans used pretty much every single part of the bison, their hide, their food, everything. The white guys came along and just said, hey, yeah, we'll take that hide, and didn't really use it, but they knew that it would push, not all they, right? So like not every single group of white man who came here, but a lot of them wanted to hurt the Native American species and knew that they lived off of bison for food, and so pushed them closer to starvation by eliminating them. So that's what you see there is a whole bunch of dead bison head. So they're not in the numbers that they used to be, and they kept the grasslands in check and kept the grasslands healthy. And without the bison, the grasslands have taken a hit in terms of its ecosystem balance for sure. There are also indicator species. So these are, think of like biological smoke alarms. These are species that indicate if something is changing in that community. So these are species that are very sensitive to change. Obviously, many species will react to big change. We're seeing many species react to climate change, but these are the species that first identify something's going on here in terms of pollution or temperature change or pH, things like that. So the presence or absence of trout species, because they're an indicator species, shows that there's probably a temperature or oxygen level change because they're very sensitive to those changes. The spotted owl is also an indicator species. When we see the populations of spotted owls decline, that's an indication something's going on as well. Um, Many amphibian species are indicator species. And the reason, this is always a good thing to remember, the reason that amphibian species are so sensitive is because they can absorb so much through their skin. We have very protective skin. And so we're not absorbing a ton of pollutants through our skin. But because their skin is so absorbent, a lot of it does go through their skin. And so they're an indicator of something going on. I want to clarify back to this definition of indicator species. These are natural identifiers. Okay. So this is not the same thing as taking you guys have probably heard of like the song in the coal mine, the songbird in the coal mine. What kind of, I'm blinking which kind of bird it is that oh, it's like right on the tip of my tongue. Canary, the canary in the coal mine. The canary in the coal mine is not an indicator species in its true sense. We as humans took a canary and put it in a coal mine. And then if it stops singing, that tells us that there's a toxic pollutant down there. And so like, humans don't go down there. That's not an indicator species. That's not a natural place where a canary lives. They don't live in coal mines. Okay, so we're talking about a natural environment in which they're indicating a change different than I've seen test questions like FRQ questions where people are like, oh, the canary. No, 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 not an indicator species. Indicator species, it's a natural environment. Just a couple other things to briefly talk about. A living system maintains stability through constant change in response to environmental conditions. In other words, environmental conditions are happening. How can a population sustain itself? How can a community sustain itself? So, one way is if it has inertia or persistence, the ability of a living system to resist being disturbed. Climate's changing, no big deal. We're gonna be able to adapt to it, okay, to resist that change. Constancy, the ability of that system to keep its numbers within the limits of its available resources. So maybe that change is causing some individuals to die, but if they can keep the living numbers high enough that it's not affecting it, then that's staying constant, relatively constant. Some species die, but the population as a whole is staying constant. And then resilience, okay? So some type of change happened, climate change, whatever it is, it doesn't have the ability to bounce back. Or is it not resilient, meaning that if something happens to it, it cannot bounce back. So it is resilient if it can bounce back after the damage is done. And we'll end on a core case study, the American alligator. So humans are obviously scared of alligators. And so there was a big push to kind of get rid of the American alligators in the Florida area. But what we didn't realize is the importance of American alligators, actually keystone species. And here's why. So one of the things that they do is they dig deep depressions. We call them gator holes. And those holes fill with water. So when there are dry spells, that's a source of water for many species. It's a refuge for aquatic life when there are, semi-drought conditions and things like that. And we didn't realize the importance of those gator holes having that water. Those deep depressions are also like nest building opportunities. They provide nesting for birds. In some cases, the only place that these birds can nest. And so again, keystone species, the only place these birds can be found. And it also keeps areas of open water free of vegetation by kind of crushing that vegetation. So it's keeping open water. So all these things that these gator holes did, that these alligators provide for us, that we didn't realize. So they were really, really important to community structure in the Florida Keys. And the hunters were wiping out these populations, partially based on fear, almost to the point of extinction, because we didn't realize their ecological role. And so there's a big movement to try to protect the American alligators, and how to go about doing that and keeping humans safe as well, because that's important as well. So thank you for your attention and have a great day.